Okay, today we're looking at the top 10 quarterbacks of the 1980s, and starting our list off at number 10 is Ron Jaworski. Jaworski was drafted in the second round of the 1973 draft by the Los Angeles Rams and played primarily for the Rams and the Eagles. He played in the league for 15 years. 1980 was the pinnacle of his career as he came in third in league MVP voting behind Brian Sipe and Earl Campbell. He made his only Pro Bowl appearance that year, and he led the Eagles team to its first ever Super Bowl appearance. During the 80s, Jaworski threw for 20,132 yards, 126 touchdowns, 107 interceptions. He had 12 fourth quarter comebacks and 16 game-winning drives. Jaworski comes in at number 10 with an FGV score of 3,124.58. And our number 9 quarterback of the 80s came into the league as a punter, Danny White. White was drafted in the third round of the 1974 draft by the Dallas Cowboys. He would play his entire 13-year career for the Cowboys, playing until 1988. He was the team's punter and backup quarterback to Roger Staubach through 1979. When Staubach retired, White took over as QB1 and continued as the team's punter through 1984 season. He would have immediate success as a starting quarterback, leading the Cowboys to 3 consecutive NFL championship games. He was the starting quarterback for one of the Cowboys' most painful playoff losses in the game known as the Catch, and he would ultimately lose all 3 championship games. Coming in as the successor to Staubach and never reaching the Super Bowl made White a very underappreciated player. Danny White made 1 Pro Bowl appearance, and throughout the 80s he threw for 21,229 yards, 152 touchdowns, 126 interceptions. He had 11 fourth quarter comebacks and 14 game-winning drives. And he comes in at number 9 on our list with an FGV score of 3,167.16. All right, our number 8 quarterback of the 1980s was drafted in the first round of the 1977 draft by the Minnesota Vikings, Tommy Kramer. Kramer entered his career behind quarterback legend Fran Tarkenton as the heir apparent, and in 1979 he did indeed become the starter for the Minnesota Vikings. He was nicknamed 2-Minute Tommy for his reputation to lead the team for a comeback win. And during the decade he had 11 fourth quarter comebacks and 14 game-winning drives. His most famous game-winning drive came during the 1980 season as the Vikings beat the Browns on a last-minute Hail Mary pass with 6 seconds left on the clock, which came to be known as the Miracle at the Met. Tommy Kramer made 1 Pro Bowl appearance, and throughout the decade he threw for 20,903 yards, 131 touchdowns, and 128 interceptions. He comes in at number 8 with an FGV score of 3,180.22. Our number 7 quarterback of the 1980s went undrafted and actually came into the league trying to make a roster as a third-string quarterback with the Seattle Seahawks, Dave Krieg. Krieg made the team as the third-string quarterback and would gradually move up the depth charts over the next few years and would often battle Jim Zorn for the starting role. During the midseason, head coach Chuck Knox gave Krieg the QB1 role again after Zorn had faltered the first part of the season. Krieg clicked with Steve Largent and Kurt Warner and sparked the Seahawks to make the playoffs for their first time in the franchise's young 8 seasons in the league. And during their run to the playoffs, Krieg and the Seahawks would upset Steve DeBerg and the Broncos and Dan Marino and the Dolphins before falling to the eventual Super Bowl champions, the Oakland Raiders, in the AFC Championship game. That's right, football fans, the Seahawks franchise started their journey in the AFC. Now, Krieg would make the Pro Bowl 3 times, and during the 1980s, he would throw for 20,858 yards, 169 touchdowns, 116 interceptions, and he had 12 fourth quarter comebacks and 14 game-winning drives. Krieg comes in at number 7 on our list with an FGV score of 3,384.32. Okay, the quarterback taking us to the halfway point on the list at number 6 was drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals in the second round of the 1981 draft, Neil Lomax. Lomax would share the starting role with veteran quarterback Jim Hart in 1981. Lomax would then start every game of the strike-shortened 1982 season and made his only playoff appearance, during which he threw for 385 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions in a losing effort against the Packers. He would start most of the games of the 1983 season, and after the season, the Cardinals released Jim Hart and fully relied on Neal for the 1984 season, which was by far his best season of his career. He would throw for over 4,600 yards, 28 touchdowns, and 16 interceptions with a completion percentage of 61.6, all career highs. He would continue on as QB1 for the 4 seasons, starting the lion's share of games each season, and was forced to retire before the 1990 season due to a severely arthritic hip. For the decade, Lomax passed for 22,771 yards, 136 touchdowns, 36 interceptions. He had 11 fourth-quarter comebacks and 12 game-winning drives. He takes the number 6 spot on our list with an FGV score of 3,458.44. Our number 5 quarterback on the list today, and our first Hall of Famer on the list, was drafted first overall in the famed QB class of 1983 by the Colts, John Elway. Now, John Elway's path to the NFL was a difficult one to be sure, as he publicly stated before the draft he would not play for the Colts. The Colts in turn engaged in trade talks for Joe Montana with the 49ers, as they had a down year in 1982. And they also talked to the Chargers about Dan Fouts, who was trying to negotiate a new contract. Now, by the time the draft came around, Elway was firm in his stance that he would play for Major League Baseball's New York Yankees instead of ever playing for the Colts. Well, the Colts went ahead and drafted him anyways, and they later traded him to the Denver Broncos for offensive lineman Chris Hinton, backup quarterback Mark Herman, and a first-round pick in 1984, which later turned into offensive lineman Ron Salt. Elway would go on to start 10 games his rookie season. He then became the full-time starter for the Broncos for the remainder of his 16-year career. As mentioned earlier, Elway is a Hall of Famer, inducted in 2004. He made 9 Pro Bowl appearances and is a 2-time Super Bowl champion. Throughout the 80s, he threw for 21,195 yards, 120 touchdowns, 114 interceptions. He had 16 fourth-quarter comebacks, 15 game-winning drives, and was the league MVP in 1987. Elway is our number 5 quarterback of the 1980s with an FGV score of 3,626.80. Our number 4 quarterback of the 80s was a surprise first-round pick by the New York Giants in 1979, Phil Simms. Simms played his entire 14-year career for the Giants, struggling early on due to injuries and inconsistent play. He started 11 games in his rookie season and finished second in Offensive Rookie of the Year voting behind Earl Campbell. In 1980, he started 13 games, producing a career-worst 48% completion percentage, and started another 10 games in 1981 before ending his season with a separated shoulder. In 1982, Simms would tear a knee ligament in the preseason, making the entire year a loss. In 1983, Simms was benched by Bill Parcells in favor of Scott Brunner. Simms would come in for relief of Brunner in the 6th game of the season and would severely injure his thumb on his throwing hand, ending his season. While he was out due to injury, he began watching more NFL film at the prodding of offensive coordinator Ron Erhardt. He also changed up his strength training regimen to help ward off future injuries. And the result was an emergent offensive team leader and led to his best season as a pro, throwing for over 4,000 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 18 interceptions. Simms would appear in 2 Pro Bowls and become a 2-time Super Bowl champion. During the 80s, he threw for 24,492 yards, 143 touchdowns, 123 interceptions. He had 7 fourth-quarter comebacks and 12 game-winning drives. He also turned in one of the finest Super Bowl performances by a quarterback in Super Bowl 21. Simms completed 22 of 25 passes for 268 yards and 3 touchdowns. He set Super Bowl records for consecutive completions with 10, completion percentage with 88, and passer rating with 150.9. Sims comes in at number 4 with an FGV score of 3,639.78. Okay, let's break into our top 3 with a quarterback drafted in the 1973 draft by the San Diego Chargers, Dan Fouts. Fouts' career started off unceremoniously as he broke his collarbone in college football's Coach's All-America game after the draft in late January. He was brought in to back up Johnny Unitas, who had joined the Chargers in the offseason. Unitas retired before the 1974 season, and Fouts would battle Jesse Freitas for the starting job. In 1977, Fouts was involved in a holdout and returned to the team in November. In 1978, the Chargers hired Don Coryell, who put an emphasis on the pass game. Fouts finished the 1979 season with over 4,000 yards passing and finished second in the league MVP and Offensive Player of the Year voting. 1980 and 1981 were Fouts' most prolific seasons, throwing for 4,715 yards and 4,802 yards, with 30 or more touchdowns each season. And in the strike-shortened 82 season, he was voted as the Offensive Player of the Year. Fouts played his entire 15-year Hall of Fame career for the Chargers, appearing in the Pro Bowl 6 times, and is regarded as one of the greatest quarterbacks to never win a Super Bowl. Now, during the 1980s, he threw for 28,301 yards, 172 touchdowns, 141 interceptions. He had 13 fourth-quarter comebacks and 14 game-winning drives. He comes in at number 3 with an FGV score of 3,752.74. Okay, we're down to the 2 best quarterbacks of the 1980s. Our number 2 quarterback of the decade is a Hall of Famer that was taken in the first round of the 1983 draft by the Miami Dolphins. None other than Dan Marino. Marino was also the first draft pick ever selected in the USFL, selected by the Los Angeles Express. Of course, he didn't sign with the Express, but instead opted for the Dolphins and sat behind incumbent starter David Woodley until week 6. As a rookie, Marino set several records. He posted a 96.0 passer rating. He was selected to the Pro Bowl as a rookie. He had the lowest percentage of passes intercepted with 2.03, and he was the only rookie quarterback to lead a conference in passing. And he had the highest passing completion percentage with 58.45. Now, in his second season, Marino broke 6 more NFL full-season passing records, including the records for the most touchdown passes with 48, surpassed by Peyton Manning in 2004, and passing yards with 5,084, surpassed by Drew Brees in 2011. And he was selected as the NFL's MVP. Marino led the league in completions, yards, and touchdown passes. He would also go on to lead the Dolphins to the Super Bowl, where they ran the ball only 8 times against the 49ers, who would ultimately win the game. In 1985, Marino threw for over 4,100 yards and quarterbacked the Dolphins to the lone win over the historic 1985 Chicago Bears. Marino appeared in 9 Pro Bowls, won the league MVP and Offensive Player of the Year awards in 1984. He threw for over 3,000 yards 13 times, over 4,000 yards 6 times, and over 5,000 yards once. By the time of his retirement, Marino had completed more passes, 4,967, for more yards, 61,361, and more touchdowns, 420, than any player in NFL history, and led the league in passing yards 5 times. Now, during the decade of the 1980s, he threw for 27,853 yards, 220 touchdowns, 125 interceptions, with 12 fourth-quarter comebacks and 20 game-winning drives. Marino played 17 years in the league, all of them with the Dolphins, and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2005 as probably the most notable quarterback in the Hall that has never won a Super Bowl. He comes in as the number 2 quarterback of the decade with an FGV score of 4,326.72. And now, our number 1 quarterback of the 1980s and a quarterback selected in the 3rd round of the 1979 draft by the San Francisco 49ers. You guessed it, Joe Cool, Joe Montana. Montana played 15 years in the league, his first 13 with the Niners and his last 2 with the Chiefs. Montana would play backup to Steve DeBerg during his rookie season, but became the starter midway through the 1980 season. He became the full-time starter in 1981 and led the team to the NFC Championship game, which is now known as the Catch. They ended up defeating the Cowboys in that game 28-27 and advanced to the Super Bowl, where the 49ers beat the Cincinnati Bengals 26-21, with Montana earning the Super Bowl MVP. That Super Bowl win also made Montana one of only 2 quarterbacks, along with his idol Joe Namath, to win a college national championship and a Super Bowl. Although the 49ers missed the playoffs in the strike-shortened season of 1982, Montana had a prolific season, throwing for 2,613 yards and 17 touchdowns. And he also set what was then an NFL record with 5 consecutive 300-yard games. Montana had arguably his best season in 1983, throwing for over 3,900 yards, 26 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. For his career, he ended up leading the league in completion percentage 5 times, all in the 80s. He appeared in 8 Pro Bowls. He won the league MVP in 1989 and 1990, and was awarded the Offensive Player of the Year in 1989 as well. He is a 4-time Super Bowl champion and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2000. During the 1980s, he threw for 30,958 yards, 215 touchdowns, 107 interceptions. He had 20 fourth-quarter comebacks and 20 game-winning drives. Joe Montana is our #1 quarterback of the 1980s with an FGV score of 5,210.62. And that's our top 10 quarterbacks of the 1980s. Who is your favorite quarterback of the decade? I'll tell you that I often spend time lamenting the fact that the Steelers passed over Dan Marino in the draft. Just imagine what could have been had they taken him. I mean, maybe the Steelers would have won another 4 Super Bowls. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching today, and if you're looking for more top 10 content, check out this video right over here. And if you're looking for football card content, check out this playlist over here. In any event, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.